There is a sound a crowd makes right before something big happens. Not clapping, not talking, just breathing. 200 people holding their breath at the same time. I was standing behind a black curtain, 12 floors above the street, listening to that sound. In a few minutes, I was going to walk out onto a stage, past a row of television cameras, and pull a white sheet off a 20-foot sign. My hands were shaking. Not because I was nervous about the cameras, not because of the mayor sitting in the front row, or the reporters, or the investors who had flown in from 3 different countries to be there. My hands were shaking because I knew my father was in that crowd. He didn't know it was me. Not yet. To him, tonight was just another contract his construction company had finished. A big one. The biggest of his career, actually. The kind of project that saves a company or a family from going under. He thought he was here to shake hands with a client he'd never met. A private investment group that called itself Meridian. A group that had shown up 18 months ago with money, blueprints, and one strange request. No meetings with the founder. Everything through lawyers. Everything through email. Just build it, and build it right. He never asked why. He was too relieved to ask why. This contract had kept his company alive. What he didn't know was that the founder of Meridian was standing 15 feet away from him right now, behind a curtain, waiting for his own name to be read out loud for the first time in 12 years. My name, Marcus Bennett. The son he called a quitter at a dinner table in front of 11 relatives when I was 20 years old. The son he said would amount to nothing because I dropped out of college with 1 semester left. The son whose name he hadn't said out loud, as far as I knew, in over a decade. Tonight, that name was about to be printed in letters 4 feet tall on the side of a building his own company built. I want to tell you how we got here. Not because I want you to feel sorry for me. That's not why I'm telling this story. I'm telling it because I think a lot of people watching this have been laughed at by someone who was supposed to believe in them. A parent, a sibling, a husband, a boss. And I think a lot of people need to hear that quiet doesn't mean weak, that walking away doesn't mean giving up, and that sometimes the best answer to being laughed at isn't shouting back. It's building something so real that laughter turns into silence. So let's go back. Back to a dinner table, 12 years ago, before any of this existed, before Meridian, before the sign. Back to the night my father decided I was a disappointment, and the day, 12 years later, he found out exactly how wrong he was. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand my family first. We weren't rich. We weren't poor either. We were the kind of family that looked solid from the outside. A house with a 2-car garage, a company truck parked out front with our last name painted on the door, a mother who packed lunches and never missed a school event. My father, Richard Bennett, built that life with his hands. Literally. He started Bennett Construction when he was 26 years old. With a used truck and a bank loan he was terrified he'd never pay back. 30 years later, Bennett Construction was one of the most respected general contracting companies in our part of the state. Homes, small commercial buildings, a few schools. My father's name meant something in our town. People trusted it. And my father was proud of that name in a way that shaped everything in our house. He believed in one kind of success. You worked with your hands, you built something people could see, you never quit, and you never, ever admitted weakness. He respected effort more than intelligence, and he respected results more than effort. If you finished something, you were somebody. If you quit something, you were nothing. There wasn't a lot of room in between. My older brother Daniel fit that mold perfectly. Daniel was loud, confident, and good with people in a way I never was. He played football in high school, dated the kind of girls everyone noticed, and from the time he was 15, he worked summers on my father's job sites, learning the business. My father used to introduce him to clients as my right hand. Daniel was going to take over Bennett Construction one day. Everyone knew it. It was never even a question. Then there was me. I was quiet. I liked numbers more than football. I liked taking things apart and figuring out how they worked, but not with a hammer, with a pencil and paper, sketching out how a building's structure held itself up, or how a small business could grow if it made smarter decisions. I read books my father thought were a waste of time. I asked questions at dinner about interest rates and supply chains that made Daniel roll his eyes and my father sigh. My mother, Linda, was different. She noticed things about me that my father didn't care to. She saw that I lit up when I talked about ideas, about business, about the why behind things instead of just the how. She was the one who encouraged me to apply to college for business and architecture, even though my father grumbled that it was 4 years and a mountain of debt to learn what he already knew from doing it. But my mother was quiet too. And in our house, quiet didn't win arguments. My father's voice filled every room he walked into. Hers filled the kitchen, and only when he wasn't home. Looking back now, I don't think my father was a cruel man at his core. He was a man shaped by a hard, narrow definition of what it meant to be worth something, a definition he'd earned the hard way and never once thought to question. He genuinely believed he was preparing us for a difficult world by being tough. He just never seemed to notice that toughness aimed at the wrong target doesn't build strength. It just teaches a person to hide. I got into state university at 18. My father came to my going-away dinner and gave a short toast that I still remember word for word. "Well," he said, raising his glass, "at least one of my sons is going to get a fancy piece of paper. Hope it's worth what it costs." Everyone laughed. I laughed too, because that's what you did in our family. You laughed along with him, even when the joke had teeth. I didn't know yet how sharp those teeth could get. College was supposed to be where I figured everything out. Instead, it was where I figured out that the plan everyone expected me to follow wasn't the plan I actually wanted. I studied business and started taking a few architecture and urban planning electives on the side, because I was fascinated by how neighborhoods grew, how a rundown block could turn into somewhere people wanted to live if the right kind of investment came in at the right time. I wasn't interested in swinging a hammer like my father. I was interested in the decisions before the hammer ever came out. Which properties made sense, which risks were worth taking, how you turned an overlooked building into something valuable. In my second year, I met a professor named Elaine Whitfield, who ran a small real estate development seminar as almost a side project. She had actually built a career doing exactly what fascinated me: buying undervalued properties, renovating them smart, and either holding them or selling them at a serious profit. She wasn't famous. She wasn't rich in a flashy way. But she was independent, sharp, and she saw something in the way I approached problems. Halfway through my third year, she offered me an opportunity that changed everything. She was starting a small development fund with 2 partners and needed someone to help analyze properties, model out numbers, and learn the business hands-on. It was unpaid at first, barely more than an internship, but it was real. Not a case study in a textbook. Real deals, real money, real risk. The catch was timing. She needed someone now, full-time, not in 2 years after I graduated. If I wanted it, I had to leave school. I sat with that decision for almost 3 weeks. I ran the numbers 100 different ways in my head, the same way I'd learned to run numbers on a property. What was I actually giving up? 1 more year of classes I could probably test out of anyway, and a diploma that, in this exact field, mattered less than real experience. What was I gaining? A direct door into an industry I was obsessed with, working under someone who actually knew how to build wealth from nothing, the way my father always claimed he had. I called my mother first. She listened for a long time without saying anything, and then she asked me one question. "Marcus, is this something you're running away from, or something you're running toward?" I told her the truth. Toward. I've never wanted anything this clearly in my life. She was quiet again. Then she said, "Then you already know what you're going to do. You're just scared of your father's reaction." She wasn't wrong. Before I made the final call, I spent a weekend building an actual presentation, pages of projections, a breakdown of what I'd learned in 1 year with Elaine compared to 1 more year of lectures, even a rough timeline of how I could still finish my degree part-time later if I ever wanted to. I told myself this was smart preparation. Looking back, I think it was something else too. I think some part of me already knew I'd need evidence, like I was building a legal case before walking into a courtroom. Because some part of me already suspected my father wasn't going to simply take my word for it. I remember sitting in my dorm room the night before I drove home, rehearsing the conversation out loud to an empty room, adjusting my words each time, trying to find the version of this pitch that couldn't possibly be misunderstood. I thought if the logic was airtight enough, the reaction would have to be reasonable. I hadn't yet learned the lesson that would take me another decade to fully understand, that some reactions were never about logic in the first place. I decided to take the leap. I told myself I'd explain it calmly, show them the plan, the numbers, the logic behind it. I believed, in my naive 20-year-old brain, that if I just explained it well enough, my father would see the strategy in it. That he'd recognize a version of his own younger self, someone taking a risk to build something instead of waiting around for permission. I was about to find out how wrong I was. I came home for what was supposed to be a normal weekend visit. My mother had planned a family dinner. Nothing special, just Sunday dinner, except my aunt and uncle and a few cousins were in town, so the table was full. 11 people, counting me. I waited until dessert, the way you wait for the right moment before diving into cold water. I remember my heart pounding so hard I thought people could hear it over the clinking of forks. I actually have some news, I said. I've decided to leave school and take a full-time position with a development firm. It's an incredible opportunity. I'd be working directly under someone who's built a real career in real estate investment, learning the actual business instead of just the theory. The table went quiet for a second. Then my father put his fork down slowly, which was somehow worse than if he'd slammed it. You're dropping out. I'm not dropping out to do nothing, Dad. I'm dropping out to do something specific. There's a difference. He laughed. Not a warm laugh. A short, sharp laugh, the kind that isn't really about humor at all. A difference, he repeated, looking around the table like he wanted witnesses. You hear this? He's not quitting. He's just quitting with a business plan. A couple of my cousins laughed nervously. My aunt looked down at her plate. Daniel smirked into his glass. Dad, if you'd let me explain the numbers. I don't need numbers, Marcus. I need you to finish what you started for once in your life. His voice was rising now, the way it did when he was building towards something. You've never finished anything hard. You quit Little League. You quit the debate team the second it got competitive. And now you want to quit college with 1 year left because some woman told you she'd give you a job with no paycheck. It's not some woman, Dad. It's a professor who's built an actual real estate portfolio worth more than— I don't care what she's built, he snapped, cutting me off before I could even finish the sentence. I care what you're about to throw away. You think I built this company by chasing every shiny opportunity somebody dangled in front of me? I stayed. I finished things. That's the whole difference between people who build something real and people who spend their whole lives explaining why the next idea is going to be the one that finally works out. It's not about quitting, it's exactly about quitting. He was standing now, his palm flat on the table. You know what the difference between me and you is? I never had anyone hand me a fancy education, and I built a company that's put a roof over this family's head for 30 years. You have every advantage I never had, and you're about to throw it away to chase some fantasy. I felt my face burning. Everyone at the table was staring at their plates, at their hands, anywhere but at me. This family, he continued, and here it came, the line I would remember for the next 12 years word for word, has one son who's going to take over something real. And apparently one son who's going to spend his life chasing ideas that go nowhere. He looked directly at Daniel when he said real, and directly at me when he said nowhere. Then he laughed again, that same short, dismissive laugh, and said, almost to himself, "Good luck with your fantasy job, Marcus. Let me know when reality catches up with you." Nobody defended me. My mother reached for my hand under the table, but she didn't say a word out loud, and I remember catching her eyes for just a second, seeing something apologetic in them, like she wanted to speak and couldn't find a way to do it without starting a bigger fight than the one already happening. Daniel just kept eating like nothing had happened, a small smile still tugging at the corner of his mouth, the same smile he used to give me when we were kids, and he'd beaten me at something that mattered more to him than it ever did to me. My aunt finally broke the silence, awkwardly changing the subject to ask my mother about a recipe, and the table slowly, painfully limped back into ordinary conversation, the way families do when nobody wants to acknowledge what just happened out loud. But the damage was already sitting in the room with us, and everyone at that table knew it, even as they talked about pie crusts and holiday plans like nothing had shifted. I finished the rest of that dinner in silence. I said goodnight politely. I drove back to campus that night instead of staying until Monday like I'd planned, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached. I didn't cry. I want to be clear about that, because I think people expect the emotional moment to be tears. Mine wasn't. Mine was colder than that. Somewhere on that dark highway, something in me shifted from hurt into something quieter and more permanent. About an hour into the drive, I pulled off at a rest stop, not because I needed gas, but because I needed to sit still for a minute without the hum of the road underneath me. I sat in the parking lot under a flickering light, replaying the dinner over and over, trying to find the moment where I could have said something differently, some sentence that would have changed his reaction. I couldn't find one. That was almost the hardest part, realizing the problem was never really about my words at all. It was about a picture of me my father had already painted long before I sat down at that table, and no amount of careful explaining was ever going to repaint it for him. I thought about calling my mother right then, just to hear a voice that didn't sound disappointed in me. I didn't, in the end. I think I already sensed that if I heard her voice crack with sympathy, I might start doubting the decision I'd just made, and I needed, more than anything else in that moment, to not doubt it. I decided that night that I was done trying to explain myself to people who had already decided who I was. I withdrew from school 2 weeks later. I called my mother to tell her, gently, and she cried a little, not because she disagreed with the decision, but because she knew what it meant for the family. I didn't call my father at all. I let my mother tell him. For the first 2 years, home basically disappeared from my life. I came back for Christmas exactly twice, both times short visits where conversation with my father stayed carefully on the surface. Weather, traffic, nothing real. He never apologized for that dinner. I don't think he ever thought there was anything to apologize for. In his mind, he'd told me the truth, and the truth doesn't need an apology. Meanwhile, I threw myself into the work with Elaine Whitfield's small firm, like it was the only thing keeping me upright, because in a lot of ways, it was. The first year was humbling in ways I hadn't expected. I wasn't the smartest person in the room anymore. I was the least experienced person in almost every room I walked into. I made mistakes on property valuations that cost the firm real money. I misjudged renovation timelines. I once recommended a property that turned out to have a structural issue I completely missed, and Elaine had to walk me through, patiently but firmly, exactly what I'd overlooked and why it mattered. She never once made me feel stupid for it. That was the thing that struck me most, coming from a house where mistakes were treated like character flaws. Elaine treated mistakes like tuition. "You just paid for a lesson," she told me once, after a deal fell through because of an error I'd made. Most people pay for the same lesson in business school and never actually learn it, because it's not their own money on the line. You'll never make that particular mistake again. That's worth more than the deal was. I worked constantly, 60, 70 hours some weeks. I lived in a small one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, and most nights I fell asleep at my desk with spreadsheets still open on my laptop. I wasn't making much money, barely enough to cover rent and instant noodles for the first year and a half, but I was learning faster than I ever had in a classroom, because every mistake had real weight to it. By year 2, Elaine started giving me more responsibility. I found a small, run-down 4-unit apartment building in a neighborhood everyone else had written off, and I convinced her and her partners to let me lead the renovation and resale myself, with her supervising. It took 8 months of work, a lot of sleepless nights, and every ounce of patience I had. We sold it for a profit that, for the first time, felt like real money. That was the deal that changed everything for me. Not because of what it paid, but because of what it proved. I could see value where other people saw a problem. I could take something overlooked, invest the right amount of work and money into it, and turn it into something people wanted. I remember standing in the empty top floor unit of that building the week before we listed it, looking out at a view of the neighborhood I hadn't even noticed the first time I walked through with a flashlight and a clipboard 8 months earlier. New paint on the trim, refinished floors, light coming through windows that had been boarded up when I first found the place. I thought about my father, briefly, and how he'd have looked at this exact building the day I bought it and seen nothing but a liability. I didn't feel angry in that moment. I mostly just felt quietly certain, for the first time, that I'd chosen the right path. Elaine noticed the shift in me too. Around that time, she pulled me aside after a partners' meeting and told me something I still think about. "You have a good eye, Marcus," she said. "But more importantly, you have patience most people your age don't have. Patience is worth more than talent in this business. Talent gets you the first deal. Patience gets you the 50th. I started saving aggressively after that. I lived far below what I could have afforded, skipping vacations, driving a car with over 150,000 miles on it long after I could have upgraded, because I had a plan forming in my head that I didn't share with anyone yet, not even my mother. I wanted to build something of my own. By the time I was 24, I had saved enough, combined with a small loan and one outside investor Elaine introduced me to start my own company. I called it Meridian Development Group. I chose the name carefully. Meridian means the highest point the sun reaches in the sky, the peak. I wanted a name with no trace of Bennett in it, partly for professional reasons. I wanted to be judged on the quality of my work, not on whether people had heard of my father's construction company in a completely different market. But if I'm honest with myself now, there was another reason too. I didn't want my success, if it ever came, to be borrowed from or connected to a name that had laughed at me on my way out the door. The first few years of Meridian were brutal in ways that most people never see from the outside. I bought small, ugly properties nobody wanted. A boarded-up strip mall, a half-finished apartment complex where the original developer had gone bankrupt, a warehouse in a part of town everyone assumed was dying. I studied each neighborhood like it was a puzzle. Where was the city investing in infrastructure? Where were young families starting to move because they'd been priced out of nicer areas? Where would demand be in 5 years, even if nobody could see it yet? I got it wrong sometimes. There was a strip mall project in my second year that lost nearly everything I'd put into it, because I misjudged how long a major employer nearby would stay in business. I remember sitting in my car outside that empty strip mall the night I accepted the loss, feeling exactly like that 20-year-old at the dinner table, wondering if my father had been right about me all along. I sat there for almost an hour that night, engine off, watching a for lease sign swing slightly in the wind outside a building that had just cost me nearly everything I'd saved. I remember running through the numbers over and over, as if repeating the math enough times might somehow change the outcome. It didn't. At some point, I stopped doing math altogether and just sat with the question underneath it. Was this proof that I'd made the wrong decision walking away from school? Or was this simply what building something real actually felt like sometimes, mistakes included? I didn't have an answer that night. I only had a choice about what to do the next morning, and the next morning, I went back to the office anyway. But I didn't quit. I want to be very clear about that word, because it was the word my father used against me like a weapon. I didn't quit that night in the car, and I didn't quit for the next 8 years. I adjusted, I learned, I kept going. Slowly, the wins started outnumbering the losses. The 4-unit building, then a 12-unit building, then my first real commercial project, an old, empty department store I converted into a mixed-use space with retail on the ground floor and apartments above it, in a part of downtown everyone had given up on. That project alone tripled the value of every property around it within 3 years. By the time I was 30, Meridian Development Group wasn't small anymore. We had a real office, a real team, and a growing reputation. Not as a flashy company with a famous founder, but as a firm that quietly, consistently turned overlooked properties into thriving ones. I stayed almost entirely out of the public eye on purpose. I let the projects speak. I did interviews for trade publications under a representative of Meridian instead of my own name whenever I could avoid it. Most people in the industry who worked with us never even knew what the founder looked like. There was a strange comfort in that anonymity. At industry conferences, I'd sometimes stand next to people discussing whoever's running Meridian these days, with genuine curiosity, and I'd just nod along, saying nothing, half amused and half relieved that the name still belonged only to me. It meant nobody's opinion of my father, or my last name, or my hometown, could attach itself to what I was building. Every dollar of it, every deal, was mine in a way nothing had ever been mine before. I kept my distance from my hometown that entire time. I sent my mother money quietly when I knew things were tight for her, always through a way that wouldn't get back to my father, because I knew he'd never accept help from the son he considered a failure, even secretly, even through her. I called her every Sunday, usually on Sunday evenings, right around the time I knew my father would be out at his weekly card game with old coworkers, so the calls stayed calm and unhurried. I never mentioned Meridian's real size. She knew I was doing well in real estate, and that was as far as the conversation ever went, because I think some small, stubborn part of me still wanted my success to be entirely mine before I ever let it touch the family that had dismissed it. Once, during one of those calls, my mother mentioned almost in passing that my father had seen a magazine article about a new downtown development project and had grumbled something like, "Whoever's behind that has more money than sense." I remember laughing quietly to myself after I hung up, because that project had been one of ours, and he had absolutely no idea. I had no idea back then that all of this quiet building was leading somewhere I couldn't have planned even if I'd tried. While Meridian was growing in silence, something very different was happening back home, and I only learned the full extent of it much later, piecing it together after everything came out. Bennett Construction, the company my father had built his entire identity around, was struggling. Badly. Part of it was the economy. A downturn had hit residential construction hard for a couple of years, and a lot of smaller firms felt the squeeze. But part of it, I learned later, was Daniel. Daniel had taken over more day-to-day operations as my father slowed down in his late 50s, and Daniel had my father's confidence, but not always my father's judgment. He pushed the company into 2 large commercial expansions that didn't work out, over-leveraging the business, taking on debt to buy new equipment, and expand crews for contracts that either fell through or ran wildly over budget. He had my father's stubbornness too, the same refusal to admit when something wasn't working, and by the time my father stepped back in to try to course correct, the damage was already deep. By the time I was 31, 11 years after that dinner, Bennett Construction was carrying serious debt, losing contracts to competitors, and quietly, desperately searching for a lifeline. My mother told me some of this on our Sunday calls, carefully, the way she told me most difficult things, softening the edges. "Your father's under a lot of pressure at work," she'd say. "The business has had some rough years." She never asked me for money directly. I think some part of her still protected my father's pride, even when I wasn't in the room to see it. Later, I learned more of the details from an old family friend who still worked in the office at Bennett Construction. How my father had started coming in earlier and leaving later. How he'd quietly sold a second company truck to help cover a payroll shortfall one month. How there had been a tense, closed-door meeting with the bank about the company's line of credit that had left him unusually silent at home for almost 2 weeks. My mother told me later that around that time, he'd started sleeping badly, pacing the kitchen at 2 in the morning some nights, staring at spreadsheets he refused to let anyone else look at. It was strange, hearing all of this secondhand, piece by piece, about a man who had once seemed so unshakable to me. Growing up, my father had felt less like a person and more like a force of nature, loud, certain, immovable. Hearing that he was quietly unraveling under pressure, he wouldn't share with anyone, not even my mother, made him feel human to me for the first time in years. It didn't erase what he'd said at that dinner table, but it complicated the anger I'd been carrying in a way I wasn't fully prepared for. I didn't know the full scope of how bad it had gotten. Not yet. What I did know, because it was my job to know these things, was that our city's Downtown Redevelopment Authority had just approved plans for one of the largest private development projects in the region's history, a mixed-use tower combining office space, retail, and residential units, anchoring a stretch of waterfront property that had been sitting undeveloped for over a decade. Meridian had been circling that property for almost 3 years. We'd done the research, modeled the numbers a dozen different ways, and quietly acquired the land through a holding company before the city had even finalized its redevelopment plans. When the approval came through, we were sitting on what would become the single largest project in Meridian's history. We needed a general contractor. Not just any contractor, one with deep local relationships, a strong safety record, and enough scale to handle a project of that size without cutting corners. My VP of construction, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priya who ran our contractor sourcing, put together a short list of 5 regional firms. She had no idea about my history. To her, this was purely a business decision. Bennett Construction was on that list. I remember the exact moment I saw my father's company name on that short list. I was in my office going through Priya's report, and there it was, third from the top. Bennett Construction, 30-plus years regional experience, strong safety record, currently seeking new large-scale contracts. That last part, currently seeking new large-scale contracts, hit differently than the rest. I understood exactly what it meant. It meant the company was hungry, struggling, looking for exactly the kind of lifeline our project could offer. I sat with that information for 3 days before I said anything to anyone. Part of me, I won't lie to you, felt something sharp and complicated when I saw that name. A small, ugly voice in the back of my mind whispered that here was my chance. I could simply cross the name off the list, let them keep struggling, let karma do what it wanted to do without my involvement. Nobody would ever have to know I'd even seen the name. But that voice didn't sit right with me for long. It wasn't who I wanted to be, and more importantly, it wasn't fair to the people who worked for Bennett Construction, the crews, the project managers, the office staff who had nothing to do with a dinner table argument from 12 years ago, and everything to lose if the company folded. And somewhere underneath all of it, if I'm honest, there was still a part of me that thought about my mother, about the life she'd built alongside my father, about what it would mean for her if everything they'd worked for collapsed. I made a decision. I would let the process run exactly as it should, fair, thorough, based entirely on merit. And if Bennett Construction earned the contract on its own qualifications, I would award it to them. Not out of pity, not out of revenge, purely because it was the right business decision if their bid was genuinely competitive. I instructed Priya to run a completely standard bidding process, with one condition I gave for reasons she didn't fully understand: absolute confidentiality on the ownership of Meridian. All communication would go through our legal and project management team. No direct meetings with me. If any contractor asked who was behind the project, they were to be told only that it was a private investment group that preferred to remain out of the public eye until completion, which honestly wasn't unusual for large developers at all. Bennett Construction's bid came back strong, genuinely strong, competitive pricing, a solid safety record, a realistic timeline, and references that checked out completely. My father, whatever his flaws, had built a real company with real standards. Whatever mess Daniel's expansion had created financially, the actual construction work Bennett Construction produced was still excellent. That much, at least, hadn't changed. They earned the contract. Not because I was their son, because they were good at what they did. Over the next 18 months, Bennett Construction built Meridian Tower from the ground up. I received weekly project updates through Priya and our project management team. Photos of the foundation being poured, the steel frame going up floor by floor, the glass exterior finally taking shape. I recognized my father's handwriting on some of the early site documents that got forwarded to me for approval, a detail that hit me harder than I expected the first time I saw it. I never met him during construction. Not once. I made sure of that. I wanted the project done right, and I wasn't ready, not yet, for what it would mean to stand in front of him. But every single day, somewhere across town, my father was building something for me without knowing it. And somewhere in that irony, I think I found more peace about that dinner table than I had in the previous 11 years combined. 18 months later, Meridian Tower was finished. 32 floors of office space, retail, and residential units, anchoring a waterfront that had been an empty lot for over a decade. It had already been named, before a single tenant moved in, one of the most significant redevelopment projects the city had seen in 20 years. The opening ceremony was planned as a major public event. The mayor was attending, along with city council members, major tenants who'd already signed leases, local media, and of course the entire leadership team of Bennett Construction, who had every right to be proud of what they'd built. I had a decision to make. For 18 months, I had stayed anonymous. I could have kept it that way. I could have sent a representative to accept recognition on Meridian's behalf, the way I'd done for smaller projects for years, and let my father go the rest of his life, never knowing his son was the client who had just saved his company. But something in me, the same something that had sat in that car outside a failed strip mall years earlier and refused to quit, told me it was time. Not for revenge. I want to be honest about that, because I know how this story could easily turn into one about getting even, and that was never really what drove me, not by the end. I wanted my father to know the truth for one reason. Because I had spent 12 years being told, implicitly and explicitly, that I would amount to nothing. And I thought he deserved to know, clearly and undeniably, exactly how wrong that judgment had been. Not so I could gloat. So that the record could finally be corrected. For him, and honestly, for the 20-year-old version of me who never stopped hearing that laugh in the back of his mind. I told Priya and my small executive team the truth for the first time, just days before the event. I told them who I was, and who my father was, and that I intended to reveal it publicly during the ceremony. They were shocked, genuinely stunned, several of them told me later, because in 18 months of working with me on this exact project, I had never once let it slip. We planned the reveal carefully. The ceremony would follow the usual format: remarks from the mayor, remarks from city officials, and then remarks from the founder of Meridian Development Group, who would unveil the building's permanent signage as the final act of the ceremony. Nobody outside my small circle knew that founder's name yet. Not the mayor's office, not the press, not my father. The night before the ceremony, I called my mother. I hadn't planned to tell her in advance, but standing in my hotel room looking out over the city, I realized I couldn't let her walk into that ceremony blind, not after everything. "Mom," I said, "I need to tell you something before tomorrow." I told her everything. Meridian, the tower, the contract, all of it. There was a long silence on the phone. Then she started crying. Not sad crying. I could tell the difference even over the phone. "Marcus," she finally said, "I always knew. I don't know how I knew, but I always believed you were going to prove him wrong someday. I just never imagined it would be like this." "Will you be there tomorrow?" I asked. "I wouldn't miss it for anything in this world," she said. "And Marcus, whatever happens with your father tomorrow, I am so, so proud of you. I have been every single day for 12 years. That was the first time anyone in my family had said those words to me since I was a teenager. I stood in that hotel room and let myself cry for the first time in longer than I could remember. The next evening, the plaza in front of Meridian Tower was packed. Rows of chairs faced a temporary stage, with the building rising behind it, its lower facade still covered by a massive white cloth banner that would drop to reveal the permanent signage once the ceremony reached its final moment. I stood behind the curtain at the side of the stage, watching through a gap in the fabric as the crowd settled in. I saw my father near the front, in his good suit, the one I remembered him wearing to weddings and funerals. He looked older than I expected, more gray in his hair, a little more weight in his shoulders, as if the last few years had pressed down on him harder than he let anyone see. Next to him sat Daniel, and a few seats down, I spotted my mother, sitting slightly apart from them, glancing occasionally toward the stage with an expression I recognized instantly. She knew what was coming, and she was holding her breath right along with me. The mayor gave her remarks about revitalization and investment in the community. A city council member spoke about jobs created and tax revenue restored to a neglected part of downtown. Then the master of ceremonies stepped up to the microphone. "And now," she said, "it's my honor to introduce the man whose vision brought Meridian Tower to life, the founder and CEO of Meridian Development Group, Mr. Marcus Bennett." I heard my own name echo across that plaza, amplified through speakers, landing on 200 strangers and one family who had no idea it was coming. I walked out from behind the curtain into the lights. I found my father's face in the crowd almost immediately. I watched the exact moment his expression changed. Confusion first, as if his brain was refusing to process what his eyes were seeing, then something closer to shock as the pieces clicked into place. Marcus Bennett, his son, standing on that stage in a tailored suit, about to speak to 200 people as the man who had built this entire tower. I gave brief remarks, thanking the city, thanking our investors, thanking our partners. And then, because I had planned this part carefully, I said one more thing before the reveal. I want to specifically thank the general contractor on this project, Bennett Construction, whose craftsmanship and integrity turned our blueprints into reality over the past 18 months. Their work speaks for itself, and I'm proud that a local company built something this significant for our own community. I watched my father's face as I said his company's name. He was staring at me like he was seeing a ghost. "And now," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, "I'd like to unveil what we've all been working toward." I pulled the release cord. The massive white banner dropped away from the building's facade in one smooth motion, and there it was, carved into polished stone above the main entrance, illuminated by uplighting that caught every letter. Meridian Tower, and just beneath it, smaller but unmistakable, developed by Meridian Development Group, founder and CEO, Marcus Bennett. The crowd applauded. Cameras flashed. Somewhere in that noise, I saw my father slowly rise from his seat, not clapping, just standing, staring up at that sign with an expression I had genuinely never seen on his face before in my entire life. He looked, for the first time I could remember, completely speechless. After the ceremony ended, there was the usual chaos: reporters wanting quotes, city officials wanting photos, tenants wanting a moment of my time. I got through all of it on autopilot, my mind entirely on one thing, the conversation I knew was waiting for me. I found my father near the edge of the plaza, away from the crowd, standing alone. He'd taken off his suit jacket and folded it over one arm, like a man who suddenly didn't know what to do with his hands. Daniel was a short distance away, talking to one of his own crew foremen, still visibly stunned, gesturing up at the sign as though he needed a second opinion that he wasn't imagining it. My mother stood a little apart, watching us both carefully, ready to step in if she needed to, but wise enough, as always, to know this moment belonged to just the two of us first. "Marcus," my father said when I walked up. His voice was different than I'd ever heard it. Smaller. "Dad." He looked up at the building, then back at me, like he was trying to reconcile the two images in his head. "This is yours. All of it." "All of it," I confirmed. "You built this. You built this whole company, Meridian." He said the word like he was testing whether it was real. "How long?" 12 years, I said. "Since about 6 months after I left school." He was quiet for a long moment. I watched something move behind his eyes: pride, confusion, and something that looked almost like grief.
like he was mourning 12 years he could never get back. "You hired us," he finally said. "You chose Bennett Construction. Why?" "Because your bid was the strongest one we received," I said honestly. "I want to be clear about that. I didn't hire you out of guilt or obligation. Your company earned this contract fair and square. I made sure of that specifically, actually. I stayed completely out of the selection process until the decision was already made." He absorbed that for a moment. "And once you found out we'd won it, you could have backed out, found someone else. Nobody would have known." "I thought about it," I admitted. "For about 3 days, honestly, I thought about it." "Why didn't you?" I thought carefully about how to answer that, because I wanted to be honest, not cruel, and not fake either. "Because I spent a long time being angry at you, Dad. For a long time, if I'm being honest, some part of me wanted exactly this moment. Wanted you to feel small the way I felt small at that table 12 years ago. But somewhere along the way, building all of this, I realized that if I let that anger make my decisions for me, I'd just become a different version of the same thing that hurt me. So I let the business decision be a business decision, and I let this moment be about the truth, not about revenge." He looked past me at the sign one more time, reading it silently, his lips moving slightly over the words like he needed to see them a second time to believe them. "Founder and CEO," he said quietly. "Marcus Bennett." He shook his head slowly. "I used to tell people at the lumber yard that my oldest son was going to run Bennett Construction someday, and my youngest son was off chasing something nobody could explain. I said it so many times I actually believed it was the whole truth." He paused. "I never once considered that the thing I couldn't explain might just be something I wasn't smart enough to understand yet." His eyes were wet. I had genuinely never seen my father cry, not once in my entire life, and I watched him fight it now, jaw tight, blinking hard. "I was wrong about you," he said finally, the words coming out rough, like they'd been stuck somewhere for a long time. "That night at dinner, everything I said. I was wrong, Marcus. I've thought about that dinner more times over the years than you probably know. I just never had the courage to call you and say it." "I know," I said quietly. "I heard about it from Mom, some. The pride thing. I understand it better now than I did back then, honestly. I've made my own mistakes running Meridian. I've had to learn that being wrong isn't the same thing as being weak. Your brother's business decisions nearly buried us," he said, glancing toward Daniel. "I spent years pushing you toward being like him, and it turns out the path I mocked was the one that just saved this family's company." "Daniel's not a bad person," I said, because it was true, and because I didn't want this to become about tearing my brother down the way I'd once been torn down. "He just made mistakes with too much confidence and not enough caution. That's not unforgivable. It's just human." My father nodded slowly, looking back up at the sign glowing above us. 12 years, he said again, mostly to himself. 12 years, I agreed. "But I'm here now, and I'd like it if we could figure out what comes after this, if you want to." He looked at me for a long moment, and then he did something I hadn't expected. He reached out and pulled me into a hug, the first real hug I could remember from him since I was a small child. It wasn't a perfect moment. 12 years of distance doesn't dissolve in one hug under one sign. But it was real, and it was a start, and after everything, a real start was more than I ever thought I'd get. I didn't sleep much the night of the ceremony. I sat by the window of my hotel room until almost 4 in the morning, watching the lights of Meridian Tower still glowing across the water, half expecting the entire night to feel like something I'd dreamed. By 8 the next morning, my phone was already full. Reporters from 2 business publications wanted follow-up interviews, curious about the story behind the story. A private developer who had operated in near total anonymity for over a decade, revealed to be the estranged son of the very contractor who built his signature project. It was, I'll admit, a better headline than any of them realized at first. A local news producer called it the best local story nobody saw coming.
One business journal ran a piece the following week with a headline calling me a quiet, unlikely success story, which made me laugh out loud alone in my office, because I had never in my life thought of myself in those terms. I gave a short, careful interview to one outlet, mostly because Priya convinced me that total silence would only fuel speculation, and speculation was rarely kind. I kept it simple. I talked about the 12 years of work, about Elaine's mentorship, about the neighborhoods we'd helped revive along the way. I said one line about my family that ended up quoted everywhere, that sometimes the people who doubt you the loudest just can't see the whole picture yet, and that doesn't mean you stop building the picture. I didn't mention the dinner table. I didn't need to. Anyone who has ever been underestimated by someone close to them understood exactly what I meant without me spelling it out. What surprised me more than the media attention was the reaction from people who had worked with me for years without ever knowing the full story. Priya came into my office the day after the interview ran and just stood in the doorway for a moment before saying, 12 years, and you never once mentioned any of this. Not once in all those late nights working on this deal. I told her the truth, that it never felt relevant to the work, and that some part of me had needed the work to exist entirely on its own, without my family's shadow attached to it. She nodded slowly and said something I've held on to since, that she thought that was exactly why it turned out this well, because I'd built it clean. Word reached Bennett Construction's office quickly, too. My mother told me later that the crews who had worked on Meridian Tower for 18 months were stunned to learn the mysterious hands-off client they'd been building for was their own boss's son. A few of the older guys who remembered me from when I used to hang around job sites as a kid, long before that dinner, told my father they'd always thought there was something sharp about the quiet Bennett boy. My father apparently didn't have much to say back to them. According to my mother, he just nodded and went back to reviewing blueprints, the way he always did when he didn't know how to put a feeling into words. I won't pretend everything was perfectly resolved that night, because life doesn't actually work that way, no matter how satisfying a clean ending might feel. My father and I spent the next year slowly rebuilding something between us, not the relationship we might have had if that dinner had never happened, because you can't undo 12 years, but something honest, built carefully, conversation by conversation. We had dinner together, just the two of us, for the first time in over a decade, about 3 weeks after the ceremony. It was awkward. We didn't know how to talk to each other without old patterns creeping in. But we kept trying, and it got a little easier each time. I helped Bennett Construction restructure some of its debt, not as a gift, but as a genuine business partnership. Meridian became a recurring client, and I connected my father's company with 2 other developers I trusted, giving them the stable pipeline of work they desperately needed. My father, to his credit, never once tried to trade on being my father to get special treatment beyond what was fair. If anything, he was harder on his own crews on Meridian projects than on anyone else's, determined to prove, to himself as much as to me, that Bennett Construction deserved every contract on its own merit. Daniel and I had a longer road. There was more resentment there than I expected, honestly. Some part of him seemed to feel like my success made his struggles look worse by comparison, and it took time and a few difficult, honest conversations before we found our footing as brothers instead of rivals. We're not as close as I sometimes wish we were, but we're building something. That's enough for now. My mother, more than anyone, felt like she finally got to exhale. She told me once, almost a year after the ceremony, that watching that sign drop that night was the proudest moment of her entire life. Not because of the money or the building, but because she'd spent 12 years quietly believing in a son that the rest of the family had written off, and she finally got to watch everyone else see what she'd always seen. She also told me something else that stayed with me longer than almost anything else from that whole year. She said that for 12 years, she'd felt caught in the middle, loving both her husband and her son, unable to fully defend one without feeling disloyal to the other, and that the hardest part hadn't been believing in me. That part had always been easy for her. It had been staying quiet at that dinner table, and at 100 smaller moments afterward, swallowing words she wanted to say in my defense because she didn't think it would change anything and might only make the house harder to live in. I'm not proud of the silence, she told me, but I'm glad it never turned into you doubting yourself, because I think if you had, none of this would exist. I told her the silence hadn't been the problem. The people who mattered most had never needed to say the loud thing out loud. They just needed to keep showing up quietly, the way she always had, every single Sunday, for 12 years, without fail. I think about that dinner table often, even now. I think about how easy it would have been to let my father's laugh define what I believed about myself. I think about how many people, watching this story right now, have their own version of that dinner table. A moment where someone who was supposed to believe in them decided out loud, in front of witnesses, that they weren't going to amount to anything. If that's you, I want to say this clearly. Their laugh is not a prophecy. It's just an opinion, spoken by someone who couldn't see what you were actually capable of, often because they were too busy protecting their own definition of what success has to look like. Their certainty in that moment says far more about the limits of their own imagination than it ever says about the actual limits of yours. You don't owe anyone a loud response to being underestimated. Sometimes the most powerful answer isn't an argument at a dinner table. It's 12 years of quiet, consistent work that nobody sees, until one day, they do. I never set out to build a sign with my name on it just to prove a point. I set out to build a life I could respect, on my own terms, using the parts of myself that my family once mocked as impractical. The quiet thinking, the careful risk-taking, the refusal to quit even when quitting would have been easier than anyone knew. Sometimes I go back to that plaza, even now, months later, just to look at the building at night when the lights are on in the upper floors, and the sign is lit up above the entrance. I don't do it out of pride, exactly, though I won't pretend there isn't some of that in it. I do it because it reminds me of something I think is easy to forget when you're in the middle of being doubted. That the 20-year-old sitting at that dinner table, humiliated in front of 11 relatives, had absolutely no way of knowing that every quiet hour of work afterward was leading somewhere real. He just had to decide, over and over, on nights when it would have been so much easier to quit, and prove his father right, that he was going to keep going anyway. That's really the part of this story I want to leave you with. Not the sign, not the ceremony, not even the conversation with my father afterward. It's the part nobody claps for. The unpaid year with Elaine, the failed strip mall, and the night in the car afterward. The hundreds of Sunday phone calls where I said nothing about how big things were actually getting, because I wasn't ready yet, and that was allowed to be true. Success, real success, almost never looks like the moment it gets revealed. It looks like 12 years of nobody watching. The sign was never really the point. It was just the moment everyone else finally caught up to something I'd already decided about myself a long time ago, alone in a car on a dark highway, 12 years earlier, that I was not what that laugh said I was. And neither, I suspect, are you.